Σας ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ. Καλησπέρα. Είναι υπέροχο να βρίσκομαι εδώ στη όμορφη χιό και όχι στη Σκόπελο. Θα μιλήσω στα αγγλικά, μα αργά. I am a professor, Catietes, of ancient Hellenic literature, so I thought I might give you a quick overview of the unique poetic culture of the islands of the Northeast Aegean in antiquity, according to what people are thinking at the moment. I'll be talking about 3 islands. I'll be talking about Lesbos, Samos, and of course Chios, and their poets over a 1,000-year era, from the 8th century BC through to the 3rd century AD. And this will be a story about culture, about politismos, and about Hellenismos, and about Greek identity. A story of both tradition and change. Tradition, because these islands kept alive the memories of the great poets of the past throughout antiquity. And change, because the Hellenic world did change enormously over that 1,000-year period, dramatically so. At the start of this period, in the 8th century BC, Greece, Hellas, Ellada, was just an idea. The reality was hundreds, thousands of independent cities and islands, all competing with each other. Now, over time, as we know, some cities grew in importance and began to dominate each other. And in the 5th century, Athens, in particular, became an imperial capital, dominating fellow Hellenes across the Aegean Sea, including Chios itself. From the late 1st century BC onwards, Greece became part of the Roman Empire. The Romans completely dominated the Hellenic world, including, again, Chios, Lesbos, and Samos. But amid all of this change, and this is the point I'm really trying to make in this very short talk, amid all of this change, Hellenic identity remained preserved because it was tied to memory. And in particular, this is the point I'm focusing on, the memory of the poets of the past. Now, in the earliest periods, islands like this were dominant powers. As I say, remember, there are thousands of separate cities all over the Greek world, and they're competing with each other. And an island is a very good space to exercise power from, because if you are a leader of a small community on an island, you can grow that community, you can dominate the entire island, and then you can dominate the neighboring island. So it's in the early stage of Greek culture, of Hellenismos, then being on an island is a huge advantage. And of course, early Greek culture was built around the sea, about sea travel, about trade and colonization. The earliest Hellenic myths that we know of course, are all about sea travel and islands. We think first of Homer's Omiros and the Odyssey. We think of the tale of a man's journey from the Trojan War back to his home island of Ithaca, via a series of encounters with Kirke, with Calypso, the Cyclops, and so forth. And these are all, of course, set on islands. Island culture is at the heart of the early Greek experience. Now, I want to begin really in earnest, not in the earliest period, in the 8th century BC, but in the 6th century BC, because this is the most important period for this region, for the islands of this region. Lesbos, Chios, and Samos were home to powerful kings whose power grew as they dominated the islands and the surrounding islands. So Chios took control of the smaller islands to the east. I think the east is that way. Maybe I'm wrong. The smaller islands to the east, the Inises, and claimed Psara to the west, as well as sites on the mainland. On Lesbos, of course, Mytilene was the royal capital, and it claimed territories not only on the Anatolian mainland, in what is now Turkey, but further afield as well, including even in Egypt. And on Samos, to the south of us, the famous king Polycrates built up a vast marine empire. So these islands were hugely powerful in the 6th century BC. That's where our story starts, with the power and the wealth of these islands and the kings that dominate them. Because at the same time that these islands are politically important, they become places that celebrate poetic culture as well. Each of the three islands celebrates poetic culture in a different way, as we'll see. Lesbos, most famously, produced two absolutely brilliant poets, unparalleled poets, Sappho and Alkaios. Their poems are quite unlike other Hellenic poetry of the time in their meter, their dialect, and their themes. They are themes of emotion, powerful personal emotion. It's personal poetry of a kind that we don't have from earlier in Hellenic culture. Their themes deal with, not with storytelling, not with long, complex narratives, but with love, anger, jealousy, or political rivalry, which can be a form of love, anger, or jealousy, as we know. So Lesbos did it one way. It had its own poets. Samos had some native poets. We know of Asios, for example, from Samos, but not many. Instead of encouraging Samian poets, the great king Polycrates took a different path. He invited outstanding poets from overseas to stay at his court. One was the famous poet Anacreon, as we call him in English, the famous poet of love and drinking parties from Teos on the Anatolian mainland. Another was Ivykos from southern Italy. We have a surviving poem written by him that is dedicated to King Polycrates, offering him immortal glory. The Greek phrase is kleos aphthiton, a phrase that links him directly to Achilles in the Iliad. So Lesbos celebrated its own native poets. Samos invited poets from abroad. Well, what did CHIOS do? You know the answer to this. Everyone knows that CHIOS is centrally associated with Homer. It's claimed to be the birthplace of Omiros. Now, we don't know anything about the real Omiros. We don't know whether there was a real Omiros. But he was certainly treated in antiquity as though he had been a real person. And on Chios, there was a famous guild of singers, the Omeridi, who's the sons of Homer, of Omiros, who claimed to be the direct heirs to the tradition begun by the great poet of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Now, the Omeride will play an important role in our story. This era, when the Eastern Aegean islands produced internationally famous poets, was relatively short-lived. As I say, it's the 6th century BC. By the time we move into the 5th century, Athens comes on the scene, and Athens becomes a big imperial capital dominating the Aegean, including the eastern and the northeastern Aegean. There are some Chian writers from this era. One is Ion of Chios. Do we know Ion of Chios? Is he remembered? Perhaps not. He was quite well known in antiquity, not super famous. And Lycymnios was another one. So we have some Chian poets from the 5th century, and we have some philosophers and sophists. There was a historian called Theopompos, who was again well known in antiquity. But by and large, these islands ceased to produce great poets. And it's the same story with Samos and Lesbos. And even the other islands, Imbros, Limnos, Ikaria, Samothrace, the big islands in the area, they produce no poets from this time. Now, the reason for this is clear. As I say, the centres of political power shift. These islands cease to be politically dominant. Athens becomes the dominant city in the Aegean and attracts all of the literary talent to it. So there may be poets produced by these islands, but they quickly go to Athens. Athens was keen to present itself as the leader of the Hellenic world in culture. As Pericles puts it, an education for Hellas, tis Elados pedevsin. In the 4th century, of course, Macedon became the magnet, and then, of course, Alexandria in Egypt. So from the 5th century onwards, these islands were no longer politically dominant, and they no longer nurtured and celebrated their poetic talents in the way that they had done. But in the Roman period, and now we move to the later period, in the first 3 centuries AD, we find a resurgence of interest in the literary culture of the northeastern Aegean islands. This was an era when Hellenes, because they were dominated by the Romans, they looked to the past as a source of identity. And we find very many people claiming that they are the new Demosthenes or the new Omeros or whatever. They link themselves directly back to the past. The literary past becomes a source of individual, local, and Hellenic identity and pride. And connections to the past, as I say, with figures from the archaic and classical periods, anchor a sense of self, of identity, of Hellenismos in the present. The islands of Lesbos, Samos, and Chios were remembered particularly as the nurses of famous Hellenic poets of the past, and remembered through a new literary medium, which we don't associate the ancient Greeks with, by and large. But this is the novel, the mythostorema. It's invented by Greeks of the Roman period. And each of these islands, Lesbos, Samos, and Chios, is remembered for its poetry in a mythostorema, in a novel from this period. First, Lesbos, the setting for what is probably the most famous of the ancient Greek novels, Daphnis and Chloe, Daphnis ke Chloe, written in the 2nd or 3rd century AD. The author is a figure called Longos. We don't know anything about him. He was probably from the island itself, probably from Mytilene. He discusses Mytilene in a very accurate way. The tale tells, if it's an extraordinary story, it tells of 2 young people from the island of Mytilene. They're the children of rich people on the island, but for whatever reason, the parents can't raise them, so they leave them out in the countryside, outside Mytilene. And they're raised by animals in that classical, mythical way, until local farmers find them and take them in. In the course of the novel, because it's a novel, they fall in love, these 2 young people. But because they live in the countryside, they are country folk, they're simple, they're naive, they don't know what's happening to them. So they have to try various experiments to try to satisfy their desire for each other. They go to various figures and say, what is it? We feel ill, we feel sick. What is it that's happening to us? And these various figures explain to them, but they explain in not enough detail, so the young folk don't know what is happening to them. But in the end, everything works out. It's a happy ending in the end. As I say, this is a famous story. It's funny, charming, and sophisticated, and it's an exquisite blend of the pastoral, the bucolic, the bucolikos, and the romance. And of course, most importantly for our purposes, it refers repeatedly to Sappho, to the poet of the island, who herself wrote on these pastoral themes of young love, fruit, flowers, and the power of nature, which is really at the heart of this novel. My second example comes from Samos, which is the setting for an ancient novel written in around the 2nd century AD. It's again a love story. Many of these tales are love stories between a girl called Parthenope and a boy called Metiochos. And it's set, of course, back in the 6th century BC. It begins in the court of King Polycrates in Samos, our old friend. And in fact, this novel doesn't survive in full. There's an extraordinary story about how we know about it. We have fragments of it, papyrus fragments from the dry soil of Egypt. So we have little bits and pieces of it. But until relatively recently, we didn't know the full story of this novel, this mythostorema. It's an amazing story. 2 colleagues in Norway were sitting down in the 1990s, having coffee together or beer or whatever they were doing, and they were discussing what they had been working on in that day. One was a scholar of Greek literature, of Hellenic literature. The other was a scholar of Persian literature. And it turned out they were working on the same story. There was a Persian translation of this ancient Greek novel that preserved the entire narrative. So we now know the whole of this story, which 50 years ago we only had these little fragments of it. As I say, extraordinary stories. Sometimes scholars are very stupid. They do bad things, terrible things, but sometimes they do brilliant things. And having coffee with your colleagues is a brilliant thing to do. Anyway, what happens in this story? It's a love story, as I say, set in the court of King Polycrates. 2 young lovers fall in love at a symposium where the poet Ivikos is performing. And we know from the Persian translation that he played a major role in this poem, in this love story, that he talks to the young couple, he encourages them, he sings a song about their beauty, and he sings songs, many other songs of beauty, to encourage them in their love for each other. So again, Samos is remembering the court of King Polycrates as a place that nurtures famous poetic talent from abroad, in this case, Ivikos. So finally, to CHIOS. Now, what we have from CHIOS is not these love stories, but we have a fictional biography of Homer, of Omiros, written in the same period, in the 2nd century or so AD. This is the longest ancient biography of Omiros that we have. And one of the aims of this story is to explain why so many cities lay claim to being the birthplace of Omiros. Now, what we find out in this version is it's not, I'm afraid, CHIOS that is the birthplace of Homer. Omiros came from Kimi, which is now on the Turkish coast, about 80 kilometers northeast of where we are now. Omiros' mother came from there. She gave birth to little baby Omiros in Smyrna, in modern Izmir. Young Omiros goes off on his travels, as young men do, roaming around various significant places, including ancient Phocaea and now Foça in Turkey, which is even closer, it's 65 kilometers away. And here in Foça, he meets a man called Thestorides. Now, other ancient sources mention him as a poet, as a genuine poet who wrote real epic poetry from antiquity. But in this version, he's a bad man because he steals Omiros' poetry. He memorizes it. He doesn't write it down. He memorizes it in his mind. And then he goes off to CHIOS and sets up a school where he teaches people poetry which is not his. He plagiarizes it. He steals this poetry and pretends it's his. So it looks at this point as if our friends, the Omerithe, the sons of Homer, are not real descendants of Homer, that they're set up by a bad man who's stolen Homer's poetry. But things turn out all right in the end, as they usually do. Omiros finds out about Thestorides' malevolent little plan, and he travels to CHIOS himself, although he's blind by this point. Here he meets a kindly goatherd called Glavkos, who takes him in the village of Volissos. Is anyone from Volissos? No one's from Volissos. Never mind. But you know where it is. It's in the northwest of the island, of course. Now this figure, the kindly herdsman who takes in the young Homer, the young Omiros, is the model for the character of Evmeos in the Odyssey, the kindly pig herd who looks after Odysseus when he comes back from abroad. Now, Omiros is now taken on, because he's realized that he's a great poet. He's taken on by the master of this herdsman, and he composes a number of playful poems on the island, in the north of the island, in Volissos. But now he finds out that Thestorides is practicing in CHIOS town, in the Hora. So he comes down, Omiros comes down, and Thestorides hears that Omiros is coming, and he's a coward. He runs for his life. He packs up all his belongings, takes the next ship away. So Omiros ends up in CHIOS town, where he marries a Chian woman and composes the Iliad and the Odyssey. So according to this story, the Iliad and the Odyssey were composed 4 kilometers away in CHIOS town, or maybe even here, I don't know. Anyway, so the point is that this story ends up celebrating the island of CHIOS, not as the birthplace of Homer, but the birthplace of the Iliad and the Odyssey, the greatest poems of antiquity. And, of course, it means that the true descendants of Homer, the tradition, the song tradition that keeps alive the poetry of Homer, is genuine and authentic. According to this fictional story, it goes all the way back to Homer. And even in the Roman Empire, there were these people, these Omerithe, these sons of Homer, who were claiming to keep that tradition alive. So, as I say, it's an extraordinary story of cultural continuity, of the islands keeping alive their traditions. So, as I say, the Eastern Aegean islands were crucial to the development of Hellenic literature in two ways. In the earlier period, they enabled these great poets to flourish, whether by bringing up the poets from their own islands, or inviting people from abroad, or keeping the poems of Homer fresh and alive. But then later in the Roman Empire, when we get the emergence of the novel, the mythostorema, as a central form of Greek literature, the islands are remembered time and again as places that are associated with these great poetic figures of the past. And this is really important to people, as I say, in the Roman Empire, to feel that they have that sense of continuity, of politismos, of Hellenismos, of deep connection with the past, and particularly the poets of the past. Now, these poems, these ancient romances, these ancient novels, have different fates. As I say, the story of Metiakos and Parthenope was lost for a long time, rediscovered in the 1990s. The story of Omeros on CHIOS was influential, but perhaps not treated as a true story, treated more as a fun story to tell about a famous figure from the past. But Daphnis and Chloe, Daphnis Care Chloe, has been one of the most influential works written in Greek in the Roman Empire. It has inspired artists, musicians, writers, filmmakers, Maurice Ravel, for example, Marc Chagall, the famous French Franco, whatever he is, painter. Goethe was a very keen reader of this. Yukio Mishima, very controversial Japanese novelist. All of these people have been centrally inspired by this great work of literature set in Mytilene. And the reasons that these islands were so important for novelists in the Roman Empire was because they had that link back to the past, because they preserved the memory of the great poets, Omeros, Sappho, and of course King Polycrates, the patron of Anacreon and Ivikos. Even up to 1,000 years later, in a world before televisions and internet and so forth, where all you had were fragile pieces of paper to write on and memories, people were keeping alive the memory of ancient poets of the Eastern Aegean Islands, which tells us so much about the greatness of the poets themselves, but also about the greatness of the later people in Hellenic culture who kept alive this glorious tradition in the regional settings with which these poets had once been associated. Thank you.